Good morning, and thanks for coming to Story Starters for Young Children. Today I'm reading the book called Tornado by Betsy Byers. And you can see, there we go, that's a little better, picture of a black dog and a little boy. I wonder what this is about. So enjoy the things you're doing, and I will start reading. Tornado. Chapter 1, The Storm. Twister, Pete yelled, Twister! I ran for the house. Twister! He pointed. I looked over my shoulder. I could see it, a long black funnel cloud in the west. It pointed from the dark sky right down to our farm. Pete opened the doors to the storm cellar and beckoned with the straw hat. Twister! He shouted again. My two brothers ran from the barn. Pete helped my grandmother down the steps. Hurry up, boys, she called. Then she said to my mother, Come on, Beth. My mother was standing outside the door. She was worried about my daddy. Link, Link, she called. My daddy had been named for a president. Lincoln! He's in the cornfield, Pete said. He can't hear you, ma'am. Still, my mother hesitated. The cornfield seemed to be directly under the funnel cloud. He'll be all right. He can get in a ditch. You come on now. She ducked into the cellar and Pete pulled the door shut behind her. The storm cellar was dim and cool. It smelled of potatoes and pickles. My mother kept sacks of root vegetables here along with boxes of eggs and jars of tomatoes. My brothers and I sat on the dirt floor. My grandmother sat on a pickle barrel and my mother sat on an orange crate. We sat for a moment, silent. We listened to the storm and worried about my father out in the cornfield. Something that sounded like gravel was thrown against the cellar doors. Hail, my mother said and bowed her head. Pete cleared his throat. You know what brings this to my mind? He said. We knew, and my brothers and I turned to him gratefully. We saw a flash of teeth as he smiled at us. It brings to mind a dog I once had. Tornado, my brothers and I said together. How'd you know his name? He teased. Yes, I did call my dog Tornado. Pete settled his straw hat on his head and began. I remember it was an August day, a whole lot like this one. There they all are in the cellar. Chapter 2. In the doghouse. So Pete's remembering the time that he had a dog named Tornado. At breakfast that morning, I remember my mother looked up from the stove, took a breath and said, I smell a storm. I shivered a little because my mother's nose was always right. My daddy said, well, you kids better stay close to the house. The morning went by, slow and scary. We did stay close to the house. Folks didn't call our part of the country Tornado Alley for nothing. Along about lunch, it hit. Only there was no warning like we had today. No funnel cloud, no nothing. 1 minute we were eating beans and biscuits at the table. Next there was a roar, worse than a train, worse than 100 trains. And then there came this terrible tearing sound, like the world was being ripped apart. I can still hear it in my mind. I looked up and I saw the sky. The ceiling was clean gone. There was the sky. The tornado had torn the roof off my kitchen and left the food on the table and us in our seats. My daddy was the first to be able to speak. He said, well, I'm surprised. That was how we all felt. We looked at our arms and our legs to make sure they were still hooked on. Then my father pushed back his chair and said, let's go out and see the damage. Outside, the yard was not our yard anymore. The tree with the tire swing was flat. The tops of all the pine trees had been snapped off. A doghouse I had never seen before was up beside the well. A piece of bicycle was here. The hood of a car was over there. I stepped over somebody's clothesline that still had some clothes on it. The roof of the kitchen lay at the edge of the garden. It was folded shut like a book, and we walked over there. It was about time for a new roof anyway, my daddy said. He's always tried to find the good in something. I was just walking around looking at other people's things when I heard a funny rattling noise. I kept listening and looking, and finally I realized the sound was coming from that doghouse. I went over to it. The doghouse was trembling. You could see it. It was trembling. It was shaking. It was doing everything but having a fit. I peeked inside, and there was a big black dog. He was panting so hard, I could feel his breath. He was shaking so hard, the doghouse was in danger of falling apart. "Daddy, there's a dog in there." My daddy came over. "Look, Daddy, it's a big black dog." My daddy leaned down and took a look. "Well, you can come out now," I told the dog. "The storm's over and you're among friends." The dog just kept shaking. "Maybe I can pull him out," I said. "Don't you put your hand in there," my mother said. "Yeah, leave him there. Leave him be, Pete." All that day and all that night and all the next day, that dog shook. I brought him water, but he wouldn't drink. I brought him food, but he wouldn't eat. Then that night, my mother leaned out the kitchen door and yelled, "Supper," as she usually did. The dog heard her and stuck his head out of the doghouse. He must have been familiar with that word. He came out and he stood there and he looked around for a moment. There's the dog in the doghouse. He looked around for a moment, and then he gave one final shake as if he were shaking it off. Then he came over and joined us at the back door. I said, "Daddy, can we keep him, please? If we don't find the owner, can we call him Tornado? Until we find the owner, we'll have to ask around," my mother reminded me. "I know." My daddy bent down. "Let's see what kind of manners you got, Tornado. Shake." My daddy put out his hand. Tornado put out his paw. They shook like two men striking a bargain. Then we all went in to supper. And that is the end of chapter 2. And that is as much as I will read today from this book called Tornado by Betsy Byers. I hope that you'll go to the library and check it out so you can see what happens to that little boy and the dog Tornado. What an interesting story. What an interesting thought. Thank you for coming today to Story Starters, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye, friends.